As a child, I was captivated by Curious George. His curiosity, his sense of adventure, his knack for getting into and out of trouble. Reading as an adult, I can see how challenging George would be to live with. He would require patience, understanding, and a lot of guidance. Qualities I'm still learning myself. In some ways, I imagine God looks at us similarly, with grace and a sense of humor for our curiosity and missteps. What makes George so timeless is that his curiosity, mischief, and problem solving resonate across generations. Children see a playful, inquisitive friend, while adults recognize the universal lessons about learning, consequences, and growth. The Complete Adventures of Curious George brings together all 7 of the original Curious George stories, written by H.A. and Margaret Ray. I adore this collection because it offers both nostalgia and a window into the origins of an iconic children's book character who has delighted readers for decades. About H.A. and Margaret Ray. The story behind Curious George is almost as adventurous as the little monkey himself. Hans Augusto, H.A., Ray, and his wife Margaret were German-born Jews who, in the mid-1930s, found themselves living in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, newly married and brimming with creativity. They kept monkeys as pets, which makes it easy to see how George got his mischievous personality. While there, they began work on an early manuscript called Seeley G and the 9 Monkeys, the seeds of the stories that would later captivate generations. But life tested their ingenuity in ways they could never have imagined. By 1940, the Rays were living in France, and as Nazi forces closed in on Paris, they found themselves trapped in a city under siege. With public transportation shut down, Hans did something remarkable. He built 2 bicycles from spare parts, one for each of them. On these makeshift bikes, they pedaled through the streets of Paris, manuscript in hand, as the sounds of war echoed around them. Every turn of the pedals was a mix of fear, courage, and hope. At the Spanish border, they sold the bikes to French officers to continue their journey toward a waiting boat in Portugal, a mix of cleverness, bravery, and luck that reads like a story itself. After a brief return to Brazil, the Rays sailed to the United States. There, their manuscript was published in 1941, and the editor suggested renaming the main character George. Just like that, an American icon was born, crafted by 2 immigrants whose own lives were full of adventure, curiosity, and resilience. In many ways, George is the perfect reflection of his creators: mischievous, daring, endlessly curious, and full of life. Personal reflection and legacy. Knowing the Rays' story adds a whole new layer to reading Curious George. They never had children of their own, and in many ways, George became like their child. There's a funny anecdote about a little boy at a book signing who expected to meet George's parents, only to realize they weren't monkeys. That kind of playful love and care is woven throughout the stories. Hans and Margaret were an incredible team. H.A. handled the illustrations while Margaret shaped the stories. Together, they made George perfectly mischievous and charming. At first, only H.A.'s name appeared on the books because they didn't think a woman's work would be respected at that time. Ironically, though, Margaret was the one holding her own with publishers, driving hard bargains and making sure their work got the respect it deserved. Their influence extends far beyond the original books. In 1989, Margaret established the H.A. and Margaret Ray Foundation, using proceeds from the stories to support programs that foster the irresistible qualities of Curious George: curiosity, creativity, and playful learning, while also backing animal welfare initiatives and funding medical research through the Margaret and H.A. Ray Institute for Nonlinear Dynamics in Medicine. Whew, that's a mouthful. Reading the stories today, I see George as more than a mischievous monkey. He embodies the spirit of his creators, their ingenuity, compassion, and of course, boundless curiosity. Okay, the stories. The Complete Adventures of Curious George is a substantial book, truly, as thick as a high school biology textbook. But don't let that intimidate you. Each of these 7 original stories breezes by in under 15 minutes, making it surprisingly approachable despite its size. Thick, creamy pages, large friendly text, and H.A. Ray's classic watercolor illustrations give it a cozy, nostalgic feel, making it both inviting and magical. Before we dive into the stories themselves, a gentle note. These books were written between the 1940s and 1960s, and a few words or descriptions reflect the language of that time, like referring to the fat man. Today, we wouldn't use those phrases, but they can open the door to thoughtful conversation. It's an opportunity to talk with children about kindness, respect, and how our understanding of words and their impact can grow. I never want that to overshadow the heart of the stories, but it is worth noticing. Just as George learns and adjusts as he explores the world, we can reflect too. And that reflection is part of what keeps these classics meaningful for each new generation. And tucked inside this hefty, very charming volume are the 7 original Curious George stories. The real ones, before all the ghost-written sequels and cartoon spin-offs came along. They're simple, sincere, and full of heart. Let me walk you through them, librarian to friend. It all begins with Curious George, 1941, the story where we meet George and the man with the yellow hat. As a kid, I mostly giggled at George getting into trouble, but now I read it and think, wow, the patience of this man. George is sweet, chaotic curiosity in a fur coat. And this first book sets the tone beautifully. Then comes Curious George Takes a Job, 1947. George tries to be helpful. He really does. And ends up washing windows, cleaning a restaurant, and even acting in a movie about himself. It's joyful chaos and a gentle reminder that experimenting and failing is how we learn. Curious George Rides a Bike, written in 1952. This one holds a very special place in my heart. George is given a bike, becomes a paperboy, and promptly turns all of the newspapers into little boats, sending them down a stream. He then crashes the bike, ends up in a circus, and, as always, learns and grows. It's a relatable lesson in responsibility. The problems we create often feel huge in the moment, but when we pick ourselves up and keep going, they shrink in perspective, and the world does keep turning. In Curious George Gets a Medal, 1957, George accidentally causes trouble at a museum, then somehow winds up going to outer space and earning a medal, as one naturally does. It's silly, sweet, and secretly encourages kids to see curiosity as a good and even honorable thing. Curious George Flies a Kite, 1958. Very well, maybe my favorite. George gets in over his head, quite literally, by trying to fly a kite far too big for him, and ends up getting swept high into the sky. It's a vivid picture of how our own enthusiasm can sometimes carry us beyond our limits. I love how the man in the yellow hat doesn't scold or give up on George. He simply takes to the sky in a helicopter and brings him home safely. That image stays with me. A loving rescuer who shows up when we've drifted too far. Not with anger, but with calm strength and care. It's hard not to see a glimpse of God in that, graciously stepping in when our best intentions leave us tangled up in the wind. Then comes the sneaky educational one. Curious George Learns the Alphabet, published in 1963. I love this book because it folds literacy into storytelling so naturally. Kids don't even realize they're learning. They just think George is being George, and it's amazing. And finally, I love how Curious George Goes to the Hospital, which was written in 1966, was written in collaboration with the Children's Hospital Medical Center in Boston to help reassure children. This book holds their hand through a scary experience, balancing humor with comfort and that gentle Ray way. Themes and reflection. One of the things that makes Curious George so enduring is the way curiosity drives every story. George's natural desire to explore and learn turns even small moments into big adventures. And yes, occasionally a little trouble. Knowing the Ray's own history makes this all the more meaningful. They brought George to life in the shadow of war and fear, yet their stories are full of joy, imagination, and wonder. In a way, George's curiosity feels like a quiet triumph over darkness, a reminder that hope and creativity can flourish even in the hardest circumstances. Humor, empathy, and gentle moral lessons are woven into each book. George's mischief is never malicious. Instead, it opens the door for learning, grace, and problem solving in a way that feels lighthearted and kind. Kids aren't punished for curiosity. They're guided, encouraged, and celebrated for it. And the illustrations. Oh, the illustrations. Created by H.A. Ray himself, they are simple, warm, and timeless. In a world full of nonstop stimulation, flashing screens, loud animations, everything vying for attention, I find such comfort in watching my squirrely little students sit completely captivated by these soft lines and gentle colors. It reminds me that wonder doesn't require fireworks. Sometimes all it takes is a curious monkey and a good story. The simplicity isn't a limitation. It's part of the magic. Ultimately, these stories endure because they tap into something universal. The thrill of discovering the world. The lessons learned through trying and trying again, and the joy of curiosity. Decades later, George still feels fresh, familiar, and deeply lovable. Children see themselves in his eagerness and mistakes, and adults get to remember what it's like to explore the world wide-eyed and full of possibility. The Librarian's thoughts. Reading these books as an adult feels entirely different than when I was little. As a child, I just thought George was hilarious. I loved his wide-eyed curiosity and the way he always managed to tumble into trouble and then somehow charm his way back out. I was entertained, plain and simple. But now, I find myself identifying a little bit less with George and a bit more with the man in the yellow hat. Despite George's charm, his antics would drive anyone up a wall. And yet, watching the man in the yellow hat respond in patience, gentleness, and steady love has taught me something surprisingly deep. I see a reflection of God's heart in those pages, his long-suffering kindness, his steady guidance, his willingness to walk with us and rescue us, even when we veer off course for the 100th time. George is never abandoned or shamed. He's corrected, loved, and welcomed back, always. Not to say there aren't natural consequences. There are, and they matter, but they're held within a relationship of trust and love. As a teacher, this has shaped the way I approach classroom management. When a student's curiosity turns into chaos, as it often does, I try to lead with patience first, just as God leads me. These stories quietly remind me to breathe, extend grace, and remember that curiosity is a gift, even when it's messy. The beauty of the Ray's storytelling is how it meets each reader where they are. Kids laugh, learn, and explore, while adults smile, nod, and sometimes feel a gentle tug at the heart. The stories inspire imagination, patience, and problem solving, all without ever feeling preachy. That simplicity and sincerity is what makes these classics endure, delighting children and offering quiet wisdom for the grown-ups reading alongside them. Revisiting the original Curious George collection as an adult has been surprisingly moving. What once felt like silly monkey shenanigans now reads like a quiet study in curiosity, grace, and growing up, both for children and adults. The Ray's own story mirrors George's spirit, brave, curious, and determined to keep going even when the world feels uncertain. And the man with the yellow hat, steady, patient, always showing up, reminds me of God's heart toward us. When our excitement carries us higher than we meant to go, or we find ourselves tangled up in our own kite strings, He doesn't scold or shame. He meets us where we are, lifts us back to safety, and gently points us toward the next good thing. These stories aren't just childhood favorites. They're reminders that mistakes aren't the end of the story. They're often the beginning of learning, growth, and unexpected joy. Whether you're reading these with a child, sharing them in a classroom, or revisiting them because your heart simply needed to come home for a minute, The Complete Adventures of Curious George still invites us to wonder, explore, laugh, and begin again. And honestly, there's something truly beautiful about that. That's all for now. Take care, stay curious, and I'll see you next time.